Welcome to the Interpreting Wine Hospitality podcast. I am, of course, your host and podcast founder, Lawrence Francis. Welcoming you to this, my London Mezcal Week series. The series features brand ambassadors, authors, bar owners, and producers, and is the most comprehensive coverage I've ever given to a drinks category. And I think given the important time we're at in the evolution of mezcal, covers lots of the issues as well as lots of the great taste to be found within. So here we go, today's episode of the London Mezcal Week series. Today's episode of the podcast features Jesse Estes, Global Brand Ambassador for Tequila Ocho. In this interview, Jesse does a fantastic job of setting the scene for the series that lies ahead. We hear his origin story and entry into the tequila world. We discuss food pairings and the way that mezcal is enjoyed in different territories. Jesse takes us through the different definitions to be found in the category before going in depth with Tequila Ocho. Enjoy.
My dad, among other things, is the official tequila ambassador for the European Union. So he's been in the tequila business in one way or another, working with tequila and agave spirits for 43 years now. We've had Mexican bars and restaurants for the last 4+ decades. I grew up in these bars and restaurants surrounded by great tequila and mezcal, and started really probably drinking it in my teens, and then gained an appreciation for it, and of course from there gained a lot of knowledge. My official title is Global Tequila Ambassador for Tequila Ocho, but among other things I do new product development, work on some of the logistics, some of the export management, and global sales as well. So we're a very small team. We've got 5 full-time employees and 1 part-time employee in the whole world. So we all do a little bit of everything, I'd say. I'm based in London. I've been here almost 10 years now. And then the key markets I look after are mainly in Europe, places like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, places like that. And then kind of as secondary markets, Asia. So Hong Kong is a very good market for us. Australia is a great market. China's growing very quickly, and yeah, it's exciting. It's very exciting.
It's interesting for me, this being, my first ever experience of London Mezcal Week, and I'm really looking forward to today and the talks that we've got coming up. And I would imagine that an event like this is probably a really interesting meeting point, really, between people who are, working in the industry, who are like well established, and also kind of, I guess, to sort of put the hand out and kind of throw the door open for new people that want to kind of come across. And being aware as I am that a lot of my listeners are, more wine focused and potentially sommeliers, front of house, and maybe haven't had direct experience with mezcal and agave based spirits. I wonder if you just sort of give a little bit of an overview, a flavor of the category, kind of a little bit as though you were talking to that sort of crowd.
We actually had a session with Inotria & Co., who are the official partners, one of the official partners of London Mezcal Week. Last week we had a session with their full sales team. And of course, Inotria has much more of a wine background. So we really actually, talking about tequila and mezcal, other agave spirits, we found a lot of parallels between the wine industry, the wine community, and the agave spirits industry or community. So I'll talk a little bit more about Ocho further down the line, but Ocho, which is our tequila brand, takes a lot of inspiration from the wine world. So there's a lot of parallels to be drawn there. One of the most obvious ones, the ones that we talked about the most last week, was terroir. Obviously, terroir plays a huge part on agave spirits. The type of soil, the elevation, the microclimate. Especially for mezcal, the microbiology, the natural yeast living around that area plays a huge part, because it's almost always wild fermentation, natural airborne yeast for mezcal production. And so I think, a lot of people who are tapped into that complexity that you find in wine, mezcal is, in my opinion, but not only my opinion, but also based on scientific research, is the most complex spirit category in the world in terms of the amount of flavor compounds found across the whole category. So the diversity is amazing. So I think people that really can get into those organoleptic experiences through wine tasting will find a lot of enjoyment through mezcal as well. Here in the UK, typically once a year or so, we do a big 5 or 7 course dinner with Mark Hicks. And of course, everything is paired with tequila and mezcal. In the US, we've done similar things with well-known chefs out there, people like Jose Andres and things like that. So to me, tequila or mezcal or other agave spirits pair wonderfully with food. Something like a crisp, fresh Blanco with a ceviche, beautiful, a citrus-based ceviche, amazing. So it's something we've done quite a bit. I think people tend to be quite surprised. People kind of book it like, oh, this is going to be adventurous, and they actually realize, wow, this actually works really well. But I think it's not a common, it's not what people would expect. Again, you think of like wine pairings, which is very well established, that practice. But yeah, tequila and mezcal work phenomenally well. You think of like a nice, slightly smoky mezcal with grilled meat or cold cuts, charcuterie. Works really nice, yeah.
And I think it's really interesting to have you here because, given your kind of global point of view and, your global outlook that you've got, I'm curious just to ask a bit of a follow-up question there and see, okay, maybe in London, it's maybe a little bit of a sort of a one-off, it's maybe a little bit of a more a special thing. You want to have, a special dinner for that. Could you talk a bit about maybe, parts of the world where it's more sort of, I guess, more common, it's more sort of everyday, be that in Mexico or be that in somewhere, surprising that maybe, isn't South American or doesn't necessarily have the same culture and background there?
Well, to me, this is we're really talking about 2 markets when we talk about that, which would be Mexico, as you said, and the US, which make up the lion's share of tequila consumption in the world, those 2 countries. So in Mexico, it's just part of the way of life there, and I think they've done. I was reading an article. I can't remember where she was based. I think it was at a hotel in Puerto Vallarta. But she was calling herself a tequila sommelier. So you could go in. She would walk you through the whole selection, and again pair tequila or tequila cocktails with your food. So there's a bit of that going on. In the U.S., what I see is just. It's almost like the tequila or margarita consumption is akin to G&T consumption here. It's just everyone from every walk of life, people, younger people my age, middle-aged people, older people, people from lower socioeconomic groups, people from very upper class. Everyone consumes tequila. And of course, depending on their preferences, it'll be different types and different brands, but it's just so mainstream, and so U.S. is a great market for tequila. As another example, Denmark, which you wouldn't necessarily think Denmark great tequila market. There's a couple of guys out there, Max Scott and Carl Rangel, who have done Scandinavian Agave Project, and that's really what they've done is really push education and quality agave spirits in Denmark. And in my opinion, they've created a real following and good knowledge base around that. So places like Sanchez now, which is a really, really nice Mexican restaurant in Copenhagen, we've done, again, paired dinners with them. But again, you can get a nice kind of pairing experience there.
So it's great to have you, sharing that kind of perspective. And, I would also want to get you talking about your brand as well, what makes that unique. But I wonder if just as a sort of a bit of a lead in, because I don't know, speak for myself, I often confuse and maybe misuse the terms tequila, mezcal, agave. Maybe just, before you sort of go in and talk about your own brand, just give us that kind of, these are the definitions. This is, how we kind of, talk about the category without, sounding like we don't know what we're talking about and mixing up terms sort of willy-nilly.
So 30 years ago, mezcal was anything produced in Mexico using agave as a base, as the raw material, in terms of distillates. So about 25 years ago, mezcal got its own denomination of origin, which now means that mezcal can only be produced in certain states in Mexico, and following certain rules set out by the CRM, the Mezcal Regulatory Council. So tequila has had its denomination for much longer. 150 years ago, essentially, tequila was mezcal in what we would consider today in the sense of being mezcal. But it came from a specific region around the town of Tequila. So that's where it got its name. Vino de mezcal de tequila, mezcal spirit from tequila. And eventually they just shortened that name down to tequila, and then it became its own category. So the big, people always ask, what's the difference between tequila and mezcal? There's three main differences. The first is the region, and again, we talked about terroir. So the tequila region, there's a slight overlap, but basically they're quite different regions in terms of the terroir and the geography of it. The second is the agave varieties. So with tequila, we're limited to just one variety, which is blue agave, which most people, I'm sure, will have heard at least the reference at some point. Whereas mezcal actually has the ability to use basically any type of agave, which is fantastic. That's where that kind of huge amount of diversity comes in to play for the mezcal category. If you have ever heard of a brand called Del Maguey, which is really, in my opinion, they launched 23 years ago, I think now. A guy called Ron Cooper, who was originally an artist, but discovered Oaxaca and just the beautiful crafts and the beautiful people down there, the beautiful mezcal, of course, and wanted to share that with the world. He, to me, is the one who paved the way for what mezcal is now. The fact that we're even talking about mezcal is probably because of Ron Cooper. So it's important to mention Del Maguey because of that, but also because they produce in San Luis del Rio what they call azul, blue. So they produce a mezcal in Oaxaca made from 100% blue agave, which is obviously delicious. So absolutely, it's basically, if you read the law, I don't want to get too geeky, but if you read the mezcal law, they actually mention 5 specific species of agave that are allowed to be used. But then they have a kind of like almost just a little addendum, a little caveat at the bottom that says, oh, and by the way, you can use any agave variety that's indigenous to your local region, which essentially means you can use whatever. As long as the sugar content is high enough, you can produce alcohol from it. So that's kind of where that comes in. But typically we find that there's about 30 to 40 different varieties used commonly for mezcal production. So that's the second. We talked about the area, the geography, the types, the varieties of agave being used. And the last is the production process. So the reason tequila started kind of really differentiating itself, let's say about 150 years ago, is using steam instead of the traditional pit roasting method, which is kind of creating a big hole in the ground, big fire, letting the fire start to die down, putting rocks on top. The rocks get red hot, putting the agave on top and burying it underground. So that's still used today for traditional mezcal producers. But again, tequila will cook above ground using steam ovens traditionally for the category of tequila. So that's where we really see one of the big differences, and you can notice it right away when you taste some Oaxacan, especially Oaxacan mezcals that just have that kind of hit of smoke that you get on there that you don't tend to find on tequila. So then there's other examples, like purists will say that there's other differences. Purists will say that you shouldn't barrel age mezcal. So you don't see a whole lot of aged mezcal. And then, again, purists will say that you shouldn't drink mezcal below 45%. Where, again, tequila, typically you'll see in the range of 35 to 40%. Mezcal, you'll tend to see 45 to 50. So those are the main differences, I would say. So tequila, obviously, is a denomination of origin. Wine people will be very familiar with AOCs and that concept, protected names. So legally, we have 181 municipalities within 5 different Mexican states that can produce tequila. If it's produced outside of that region and not adhering to the norms, the laws of the CRT, the Tequila Regulatory Council, then legally that can't be called tequila. So we have agave spirits being produced in South Africa, in Venezuela, in India, now in the US. But if they use that word, tequila or mezcal, they're in breach of the denomination of origin rules. So that's just to mention about the tequila category. In terms of types of tequila, people will probably have heard of these before. There's Blanco, which is unaged or aged up to 60 days. Reposado, which is aged 60 days or more. Añejo, aged 12 months or more. Extra Añejo, 3 years or more. So those are the different types of tequila. There's also 2 different categories. One is 100% agave tequila, which again, people may be familiar with that term. The other type, if it just says tequila on the label, it means that up to 49% of the sugars used for fermentation can come from sources other than the blue agave. Typically, that might be sugarcane or corn syrup. So those are the main different types of tequila. You've got the 2 categories and 5 classes. There's one more class I didn't mention, which is called gold. And then we have subcategories and things like in Mexico now, Cristalino tequila is very popular, which is aged tequila that's either filtered out the color or redistilled to remove the color. So it's aged tequila that's clear, which is very, very trendy in Mexico now. But going back to Ocho, so Ocho is the creation of Carlos Camarena, who is a 5th generation tequila producer, 3 generations at his current distillery, which is called La Alteña. So his grandfather founded it in 1937, and he became very good friends with my dad some many years ago. And one day they were talking, and Carlos said, Tomas, I've been thinking, I would love to start a brand with you together. And Carlos is, I'm very biased, but Carlos is, to me, the top master distiller in the tequila world. Pretty much everyone you ask will say that as well, or they'll say he's right at the top 3 or so. Very, very well respected. So my dad didn't think twice. He had never considered starting his own brand, but he just said, let's do it. Absolutely. My dad wanted to create a tequila that he enjoyed drinking, which is very agave-led, agave-forward. So a tequila that has the most agave flavor possible. Now, that might sound obvious to the listeners because you think, well, yeah, it's made with agave. It's going to taste like agave. But there's a lot of different producers that produce in different ways. None of them I'm not saying any of them are good or bad. They're just different. And some of the ways are, for instance, very heavy filtration or distillation to very high ABV or several distillations, which all will remove some of that flavor. So again, what we wanted to achieve with Ocho was to have as much agave flavor in the tequila as possible. So that was always the number one goal, right from that moment that they decided they were going to create this brand together until now. Still, it's the most important thing that we do is to highlight the agave flavor. The second thing my dad asked Carlos was... So I grew up in France, just outside of Paris, and every year, so for 19 consecutive years for my dad, he went to the En Primeur tastings in Burgundy. So he became, well, he loves Burgundy wines, but he became really fascinated to the point of, almost obsession of this kind of micro terroir that you see in Burgundy. Like where we're sitting, which is this we're in a cellar right now, a little cave, but this could be one vineyard, one field, as you know very well, and just a few meters away you have another field, a vineyard, and the wines, it can be both same grape, Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, and it could be the same producer, same production method, and the wine tastes completely different. And sometimes, depending on the appellation, it's the wine here is 15 euros a bottle and it's 60 next door. So he really was fascinated by that in the wine world, which again, terroir is very well established and understood in wine. And he wanted to see if he could bring that to tequila. So we created the first single field tequila. We've harvested 21 different single fields to date. Every single batch of Ocho is single field. So it's not like special releases we do. It's every time you buy a bottle of Ocho, you can look at the neck. You've got the name of the field and the year of harvest on the neck label. And if you go to our website, you can actually click on the field and see elevation, soil composition, average sugar content for the harvest. So there's tons of, if you're a geek like me, there's tons and tons of information out there. To be honest, we've probably got too much information on the website, but again, that's how we like it. So Ocho became this kind of pioneer, I suppose, in terms of terroir and tequila. Other things that really link us to the wine world, I guess you would call us a minimal intervention producer. So we don't have any chemical pesticides, herbicides, chemical fertilizers in the fields. We don't have any single additive right the way through from the field to the bottle, except 3 ingredients: blue agave, water, which is our own natural spring water, and yeast. And we use natural airborne yeast for fermentation as well. So 3 ingredients that go into every single bottle of Ocho. That's it. We also do, again, relating back to wine, we do, for all of our fields, is basically late harvest. So what late harvest means for agave is a very, very high level of maturity, which means high sugar content, but also high acidity level. So again, we're borrowing this concept from wine where you want that balance. That's what you really look for in wine, is that balance between sweet and acidic, fruit and those kind of something to balance that out. So, I mean, for your listeners, I hope that it makes sense. And for us, we took a lot of inspiration. We take a lot of pride out of taking a lot of inspiration from the wine world with Ocho.
Thank you so much, Jesse. It was an absolute pleasure sitting down with you. I think your episode did a fantastic job of clearing up any misconceptions that might be out there about definitions. Do please check out below the Ocho Tequila website and main social media handles. And of course, while you're at it, head over to interpretingwine.com/listen for details of how to listen to the podcast and of course to subscribe. Next time in the London Mezcal Week series, in episode 319, I'll be sitting down with Mezcal author Tom Bullock. See you then.